one Instagram post, one influencer, one can of beer with a face printed on it. $27 billion. Gone. Not from a product recall, not from a factory explosion, not from a fraud scandal or a CEO going to prison, from a single sponsored social media post that the company's own CEO later described as a mistake. And the brand that made it the best-selling beer in America for 22 consecutive years has never recovered. 2 years later, still hasn't recovered. But here's the part nobody's telling you properly. The real story isn't about a boycott. It isn't about culture wars. It's about what happens when a billion-dollar company makes one decision, loses its nerve completely, and then watches a competitor walk away with everything it spent 2 decades building. And California, the state right in the middle of all this political noise, ends up holding the bag while everyone else points fingers at Trump. Stay with me, because this one goes deep. Now I know what you're thinking. American beer politics. Mate, why do I care? Here's why. If you've got superannuation, and almost every Australian does, your fund almost certainly holds global consumer staples index exposure. Anheuser-Busch InBev trades on the New York Stock Exchange. It's one of the largest consumer goods companies on Earth. When its market cap dropped $27 billion in a matter of weeks, that loss didn't stay in America. It showed up in global indices. It showed up in managed funds. It showed up in your balance. But there's a second reason that matters more, because what happened to Bud Light is already happening here. Woolworths pulled Australia Day merchandise in 2024, and the consumer backlash was immediate and loud. The question of whether big brands should wade into culturally divisive territory and what happens when they get it catastrophically wrong, that's not an American question anymore. That's an Australian boardroom question right now. So let's talk about what actually happened, because the version you've seen in headlines doesn't come close to telling the whole story. To understand how a beer brand destroyed 22 years of market leadership in 6 weeks, you need to go back to early 2023 and meet Alyssa Heinerscheid. Heinerscheid was the vice president of marketing for Bud Light. Smart, ambitious. She'd given a podcast interview where she laid out her vision for the brand with remarkable candor. She said Bud Light's image was out of date. She used the word fratty. She said she wanted to attract younger, more diverse consumers and move the brand into a different cultural space. In marketing terms, that's not unusual. Brands evolve, demographics shift, companies try to reach new customers, fine. But Bud Light wasn't just any brand. It was America's best-selling beer. For 22 years straight, its customer base was overwhelmingly male, working class, and politically conservative. And Heinerscheid had just told a podcast that she wanted to move away from exactly those people. Then April 1st, 2023 arrived. Dylan Mulvaney, a transgender content creator with a massive social media following, posted sponsored content for Bud Light. She was celebrating 1 year of her gender transition. The post featured a personalized Bud Light can with her face on it. It was a paid partnership, pre-approved, standard influencer marketing, and then the internet caught fire. Within hours, conservative social media had turned it into a national flashpoint. Kid Rock posted a video shooting cases of Bud Light with a submachine gun. Travis Tritt announced he was removing Bud Light from his tour rider. Country music stations started pulling Bud Light advertising. Retailers in conservative markets reported customers walking past Bud Light to grab whatever was next to it. On looked the fur, the shelf. The company panicked completely. Within days, Heinerscheid and Daniel Blake, the group VP of marketing, were put on leave. Neither defended the campaign publicly. Neither was publicly defended by the company. They were gone from view almost immediately. Then Brendan Whitworth, the CEO of Anheuser-Busch's U.S. subsidiary, published a statement. And I want to read you the key line, because it is genuinely one of the worst pieces of crisis communication in corporate history. He wrote, We never intended to be part of a discussion that divides people. We are in the business of bringing people together over a beer. That's it. That's the statement. No defense of the campaign, no apology for it, no acknowledgement of Mulvaney by name, just vague language about bringing people together that satisfied precisely nobody on earth. Conservative boycotters heard it as an admission that the campaign was wrong and kept boycotting. Progressive consumers heard a company throwing its own marketing team and the influencer it had paid under a bus, and started boycotting from the other direction. By May 2023, something happened that hadn't happened in 22 years. Modelo Especial, a Mexican lager owned by Constellation Brands, overtook Bud Light as America's best-selling beer. Just like that. 2 decades of market leadership gone. The numbers from that year are extraordinary. U.S. revenue down 13.5% in Q2 alone, $1.4 billion in lost revenue across the full year. Independent distributors, the small and medium businesses that had built their entire operations around Bud Light volume reporting, drops of 25 to 30% in many markets. And through all of it, the company kept making it worse. Months after the boycott began, Mulvaney posted a video, and in it, she said something simple and devastating. She said she had not received a single phone call from Anheuser-Busch during the entire crisis. Not one. The company that had paid her for the partnership, that had put her face on a can, that had benefited commercially from her platform, when the attacks came and they were vicious, nobody called. That statement landed differently to the boycott noise because it told a story that crossed political lines. A company used someone for commercial gain and discarded them the moment that association became inconvenient. That's not a culture war story. That's just bad behavior, and everyone understood it. So who said what? And how did the political machine turn a beer boycott into a culture war weapon? Donald Trump was first and loudest. He posted about it. He spoke about it at rallies. He framed it as consumers fighting back against corporate America's progressive agenda, regular people pushing back against companies that had decided their values mattered more than their customers. Republican politicians across the country picked up the same message and amplified it for months. Here's the thing about that framing. It was politically effective. It was also strategically brilliant in a cynical way, because by turning the boycott into a cultural identity signal, Trump and his allies made it almost impossible for Bud Light to recover. To win back conservative consumers, the brand would have needed to make a public statement that would have permanently alienated every progressive consumer. To win back progressive consumers, it would have needed to defend its original campaign in a way that would have doubled the conservative boycott. The company was trapped, and the trap was deliberate. Meanwhile, California Governor Gavin Newsom weighed in from the other direction. He made public statements defending LGBTQ consumers and criticizing the boycott, which was fine as far as it went, but it handed conservative commentators exactly the imagery they wanted. California, the symbol of progressive America, defending the exact brand decision that had started the whole thing. None of that had anything to do with what was actually happening to Bud Light's business, but it kept the story alive. And the longer the story lived, the more consumers on both sides dug in. The InBev CEO, Michelle Ducaris, went on earnings calls and described the Mulvaney campaign as a single can sent to one influencer for a personal milestone, made below the executive leadership level without senior approval. That was also not a great look, because Mulvaney's team had confirmed it was a pre-approved paid partnership, claiming it happened without senior oversight, while simultaneously firing the senior people responsible for it, sends a hard message. The message is, we'll take the commercial benefit and abandon the accountability. That's not a crisis response. That's an acceleration of the crisis. InBev eventually poured money into recovery, Super Bowl ads, sports sponsorships, price promotions, significant marketing spend, trying to rebuild a brand that had been structurally damaged. In a way, in money alone, right, cannot fix. As of 2024, Bud Light was still sitting approximately 25 to 30% below its pre-boycott volume levels. The spend didn't move the needle. It never does when the fundamental consumer relationship has been broken. Here's what the mainstream coverage keeps getting wrong about this story, and I want to be specific about it. Everyone is treating this as a story about a boycott, about culture wars, about whether brands should take positions on social issues. All of that is real, but none of it is the actual story. The actual story is about Constellation Brands, and almost nobody is telling it. Constellation Brands owns Modelo Especial. They did nothing during the Bud Light crisis except exist. They didn't amplify the boycott. They didn't post about it. They didn't run ads saying, switch to Modelo. They just sat there with a product on the shelf and waited. And the consumers who left Bud Light during the boycott, many of them picked up Modelo Especial, not because Modelo had done anything to earn them, because Modelo was there and Bud Light wasn't an option anymore. And here's the consumer behavior research reality that nobody wants to say plainly. A significant proportion of those consumers discovered they liked Modelo and didn't come back. Constellation Brands stock significantly outperformed AB InBev's through 2023 and 2024. The Bud Light boycott was quite possibly the best single business development event in Constellation Brands' history. They didn't cause it, they didn't plan it, they just benefited from it with extraordinary permanence. R.E. Hook. And here's the part that completely reframes the California angle in this story. California is 11% of the entire U.S. beer market by volume. It's the largest state beer market in the country. Before the boycott, Bud Light was performing strongly there. Large population, urban bars, and venues. Strong on-premise sales in the hospitality sector. But California wasn't where the boycott was coming from. The consumers abandoning Bud Light were in Texas, the South, the Midwest, the conservative rural and suburban markets where Bud Light had its deepest blue-collar roots. California's progressive urban consumers were, if anything, more likely to keep buying Bud Light out of solidarity. So, the political framing that puts California at the center of the story, California's values versus real America's values, is backwards. California was collateral damage in a culture war being fought by people in states that look nothing like California. The revenue loss that hit California's beer distribution network and hospitality tax base came from decisions made in corporate boardrooms in New York and Brussels, sustained by a boycott driven by consumers in Georgia and Texas. B-roll suggestion, beer distributor warehouse footage, hospitality industry workers, bottle shop, stock. Here's the prediction I'm confident making. Bud Light never fully recovers to its pre-boycott position. The data on consumer behavior change at this scale is consistent. Once consumers switch at this volume and hold for more than 6 to 12 months, the majority don't return. The brand stabilizes at perhaps 60 to 70% of its former volume and gets reclassified internally from market leader to strong secondary brand. AB InBev shifts its investment toward Michelob Ultra, Stella Artois, and Corona to compensate. And the lesson that every consumer brand on earth is quietly absorbing from this, taking positions on culturally divisive issues, carries asymmetric risk. The upside is goodwill from one demographic. The downside is permanent market share loss from another. The Bud Light data is the most powerful argument for brand neutrality on social issues that has ever been produced, and it's going to shape corporate marketing strategy globally for the next decade, right? Let's bring this home, because this isn't just a cautionary tale from across the Pacific. Cast your mind back to January 2024. Whitworth announces it's removing Australia Day merchandise from its stores. The response from a significant portion of its customer base is immediate and loud. Social media fills with people photographing their receipts, declaring boycotts, switching to Kohl's and Independence. The structural pattern is identical to what happened to Bud Light. A major consumer brand makes a decision on a culturally divisive issue, misjudges the response, and watches consumer sentiment shift faster than the company's crisis communications can manage. Woolworths didn't lose 22 years of market leadership in 6 weeks. The scale isn't comparable, but the mechanism is the same. And the question every Australian retailer and consumer brand is now asking in their boardrooms, should we take positions on culturally sensitive issues? And what's the risk if we get it wrong? That question now has the most extreme data point in modern marketing history, sitting next to it as a reference. For those of you with super, and statistically, most of you watching this have super, here's what matters financially. AB InBev trades on the NYSE as Bud. It's in global consumer staples indices that major Australian super funds hold through. Index allocations. The $27 billion market cap collapse happened fast enough to affect quarterly valuations in those funds, not catastrophically for any individual balance, but real, traceable, the kind of loss that shows up when you add it up across millions of fund members. And if you work in hospitality, distribution, or retail in Australia, the Bud Light story is a risk management case study. When a dominant brand collapses in consumer preference, fast, sustained, and driven by factors completely outside your control, the supply chain businesses holding inventory and distribution agreements for that brand carry the exposure directly. It happened to American distributors who had no part in the original marketing decision. It could happen to any Australian business built around the volume of a major brand that makes a similar misstep. The question isn't whether Australian brands will face this kind of test, it's when. And the answer to when is almost certainly sooner than you'd think. Here's the takeaway I want to leave you with. The Bud Light story gets told as a culture war story. Conservatives versus progressives, Trump versus California, traditional America versus corporate wokeness. All of those framings have some truth in them, but they all miss the actual lesson. The actual lesson is simpler and more brutal. A company that had 22 years of consumer trust, built carefully and expensively over 2 decades, discovered that trust is not an asset that survives a crisis response. Built on corporate paralysis and the sacrifice of the people it paid to take the risk. Bud Light didn't lose because it ran a campaign featuring a transgender influencer. It lost because when the campaign became controversial, the company did the one thing you can never do in a brand crisis. It tried to be nothing. It tried to satisfy everyone. It defended nothing and apologized for nothing and stood for nothing. And in doing so, it gave both sides of the argument every reason to walk away permanently. 22 years, 6 weeks, 1 Instagram post, and a competitor that simply stood there and caught what fell. And here's the line I want you to sit with after this video ends. Modelo Especial didn't win America's beer market. Bud Light handed it to them. And the company that benefited most from the biggest culture war in American consumer history was the one that said absolutely nothing. Sometimes silence is the most powerful brand strategy available. Bud Light learned that the hard way. Every other brand on earth is learning it from watching. If this gave you something to think about, the algorithm only shows this kind of content to people who've actually subscribed. So hit subscribe, and I'll keep doing the research so you don't have to. There's a lot more coming on this one. See you next time.